Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for all the warm welcomes that we have received. Rosemary sends her regards. We're always working sort of in between, staying, and so she'll probably spend the next 2 hours in the library finishing up some emails and some conversations. While I am here with you today, I was not expecting to give a lecture on the Nicene Creed here in Suva for obvious reasons. My Friday lecture will be very much on matters of context and contemporary struggles. But I was asked to do the lecture because this is part of your conference, and I know several of your faculty have also worked on the topic. So I'm very curious to see what interactions we're getting, talking about a very ancient tradition that's now 1,700 years old, and see what we can make of that. Diane and Brian, Professors Diane and Brian, I was not able to catch your presentations this morning, but Nick has sent me on my cell phone actually the paper, so I had about 10 minutes to peruse them before now. But I have a little bit of an idea that this could be a really good conversation with your work this morning as well. By the way, here's a little show and tell. This is my original book, Christ and Empire, From Paul to Post-Colonial Times. I'll pass this around. It will end up here with Brian's, and he wants it, so you can keep it. Well, he's the historian, and I'm the theologian, so this is another conversation I'll spend just a minute talking about. By the way, there's a copy of the book in the library, so you can check it out there. I'll start another one over there, and maybe Diane can keep this one. This is Jesus versus Caesar, and the subtitle is tongue-in-cheek, For People Tired of Serving the Wrong God. That's the problem, right? Who's the true God? And that's the question of the Nicene Creed. Which God do we worship? Because the big mistake these days is that people think that once you say God, you're talking about the same thing. And that's a trick that they're playing on you. Don't believe that everybody who says God means the same thing. This one over here is a historical project, goes through 7 chapters, 2,000 years of history. This one is more a theological project, talks about the theologies behind it. So, start this here. I have a few slides here. You'll see in some of the slides actually the ancient city of Nicaea. Today the city is called Iznik. It's in Turkey, little east of Istanbul, and I was just there 3 weeks ago, so you get sort of the first-hand report from Iznik as well, and a couple of the colleagues that were there with me, so you'll get this as well. Okay, here we go with the lecture. They probably told you in class that the Bible did not fall from the sky, which is something that we well understand, and so many of our biblical studies engage the Bible as a living document that has a context that needs to be understood in the context. But the same is true for the creeds. The ancient creeds of the church, the councils of the church, did also not fall from the sky, but were produced in specific contexts. History and contexts are therefore always important when interpreting these ancient creeds, just as they are when interpreting the Bible. But while biblical studies have long engaged historical methods, much of historical theology has not. In fact, a lot of my colleagues, this is not talking about the historians, but the theologians, they just open old books, Augustine, whatever, Aquinas, and they think they can just read without context. That's a problem. In what follows, I will now be doing some of that historical work as a theologian, and keep in mind, historical work is always also contextual work. The method I have developed for this work is not the traditional historical critical method, but what I have been calling tongue-in-cheek, the historical self-critical method. What it adds to traditional historical critical work is a critical analysis of the historian and a critical analysis of the flow of power. For the longest time, theologians have looked at the relationship of Christianity and culture, or Christianity in context. Looking at Christianity and empire, this is what we're going to do today. Rather than just looking at Christianity and culture, we'll look at Christianity and empire. Looking at Christianity and empire means looking at Christianity and culture and power. Or if you want to use the context word, looking at Christianity, context, and power. Talking about context without power often gets you only folklore, so we want to push a little bit further. Empire, if you will, is the combination of context and power, or culture and power. Power includes politics, religion, economics, and everything else you're not supposed to talk about in polite company. Your parents told you that, right? You shouldn't talk about politics and religion at dinner. Here we do it. We'll do that. Next slide, please. There it is. So this is the book, Christ and Empire. In that book, I go through how faith and politics have developed in close proximity, beginning with the Roman Empire up to the present. So that's part of the story. Our faith has been shaped by empires, beginning with the Roman one. There was never a Christianity that was pre-empire, it was always within empire. And this empire has shaped our faith. But the point of the book is not to lament, but to figure out what the alternatives are. So in this book, I argue that no empire was ever able to determine faith completely. Looking back to 2 decades ago when I worked on this book, I don't think I was too critical of Christian faith back then. If anything, I was perhaps a little too optimistic. Nevertheless, my optimism persists, and this is why I'm here today, except over at the United Nations or at the embassies in Suva. I think this is where the thing that matters actually happens. The theological heart of my argument is what I have called a Christological surplus, or a theological surplus. Something that is distinct from the dominant theological interests in every age. This surplus, I'm arguing, is at the root of the Christian faith's potential to resist empire and to produce alternatives to it. Note that this Christian surplus, this Christological, this theological surplus, is not something that comes to you from above and from the sky. It is something, as the word surplus implies, that has to be produced through work, that actually takes the work of the people. We often say that liturgy, the Greek word liturgia, is the work of the people. So the surplus that we're reading for today is something that comes from below, but it is driven by the Holy Spirit nonetheless. All right, next slide, please. My point here, talking about the surplus, by the way, you get some of this in terms of the method in this new book. That's my recent book, Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. That's in the library, and the Manu Falau has a copy as well that he might let you have if you ask nicely. The point here is you cannot fight dominant ideologies, you cannot fight dominant history with ideas that are merely falling from the sky. We'd love to have that, but the truth is we need this theological surplus, and we need to work to get to it. So this is what we'll do in the first part of my lecture today. We'll look at some of the contentious part of empire history and Christianity. So bear with me. The Romans had a motto that went ad aspera, ab aspera ad astra. That means through the rough things, through the rubble, to the stars. And so in order to get to the stars, in order to get to the divine surplus, we have to do some of this hard work, facing some of the problems and some of the tensions. So next slide, please. Let's begin our reflections with this person here, the Emperor Constantine. As you probably know, he was the one who unified the Roman Empire in the 4th century early on. And his conversion to Christianity was at the foundation to it. This conversion has oftentimes been treated with suspicion by those who think of conversions as purely religious events. But Constantine appears to have followed a different logic. If God rules over everything, Constantine would have thought, religion and politics cannot be separated. And neither can there be a clean distinction between spiritual and worldly power. Following this line of thought, it does not make sense to judge the sincerity of Constantine's conversion based on whether he combined political or theological roots or not. Nor does it make sense to judge the value of ancient theological positions based on whether the bishops or the emperor promoted them. A more useful question for evaluating these ancient theologies is in what respect theological and political strategies, in what kinds of political and theological strategies they endorsed. Only when that is clear can we consider what the alternatives might be. Next slide. Here you have a modern version of the ancient imperial Christ. We'll talk about that next. But let me back up a bit before we get there. As time went on from early Christianity, from the days of Jesus, a change occurred in the culture of the Roman Empire. This was linked to a change in the flows of power. In the 2nd century, the cities in the eastern part of the Roman Empire still enjoyed certain levels of autonomy, and they had their own local religious and cultural identities. In the 4th century, this is now getting closer to Imperial Constantine, political structures were centralized, with the result of producing more homogeneous religious and cultural identities. The new form of government in the Roman Empire in the 4th century centered on the emperor, who exercised strong influence in all areas of life, including religion. This dynamic also affected theology. Local religious traditions were under attack, and many of the local temples and cults were shut down. The Christian churches, which had their own distinct local traditions, were pulled into the outlook of the Roman Empire at the same time. Once Christianity had come to power, it made its own claims on the empire. Signing on to the Nicene Creed was required of those who held political office. If you're interested in history, this requirement was still in place 12 centuries later, which is why the Protestant reformers also emphasized their loyalty to the ancient creeds. That's not well known. Everybody knows the Protestant reformers liked some of the ancient creeds, but there was a political reason for it as well. Next slide. This newly gained influence came at a cost. When Constantine put the administration of the support of the poor exclusively in the hands of the bishops, so the bishops now rose through the ranks, they became the ones who administered the support of the poor. Once that happened, both the bishops and the poor were brought under control. Gradually, the bishops became known as controllers of the crowds, and in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the bishops became responsible for the defense of law and order. The growing bonds between church and empire were solidified economically. Once they began collaborating with the emperors, the wealth of the bishops soon exceeded the wealth of secular holders of office. By the way, this slide shows two interesting coins that were on display in Nicaea. As you can see, they bear the image of Christ. So now you have Christ on the coins, Christ, Christology, Christianity, religion, and the economy securely joined. That did not quite happen in the 4th century, but it started in the 7th century. And so this is yet another tradition that shows you how closely faith and money are related. In many ways, it reminds me of what's going on in the United States today, and we can talk about that later as well. Make sure you note some questions in your mind, because I want to have a real discussion afterwards where we can talk about the implications of all of this. But money and power here shape religion to the core. That has to be at least understood. So let's take a closer look at the Council of Nicaea in this light and draw some conclusions that point us to the relevant theological connections. Note first of all that the council followed the style of imperial government in that it produced decrees and pronouncements declared binding for all. This was not the case before Constantine, and it changed later on. Everybody always knows that after Constantine, after a while Christianity went in separate directions. But don't forget that before Constantine, Christianity was also quite diverse. You think about the diversity here, think about the New Testament, where you have very different opinions and different books. So it's more like an hourglass. Christianity starts diverse, becomes closely knit together in the 4th century, and then moves apart again later. But this is what happens here now with Constantine. We have this imperial moment of control. Next slide. This is a famous depiction that you may have seen of the Nicene Creed. You see Constantine sitting there in the front, wearing the crown. This is also on display in one of the museums in Nicaea. Just took that recently. In the speech at the council, so we're now looking at Constantine. Constantine gave a speech at the council, which of course was not recorded, but in the version of Eusebius, this was the church historian, this was Constantine's historian, it sounded like this. First, in the speech, Constantine recalls his victory over his rival co-emperor Licinius. He praises the resulting unity of the empire, and then addressed the theological tensions that threatened the unity. So here's what Eusebius remembers Constantine saying. This is a quote. "For me, internal divisions in the Church of God is graver than any war or fierce battle, and these things appear to cause more pain than secular affairs." This is Constantine. So he was worried about division and thinking about the damage this does. His concern at the Council of Nicaea then has to do with creating unity. Not just unity among Christians, but really the unification of the Roman Empire. Keep in mind, Constantine not only called the council, he also funded the travel and the expenses of the bishops. He determined the agenda, he chaired the meetings, and he actually suggested the key theological term of the homoousios, to which we'll get in just a minute. I always advise my students, pay attention to who funds your travels. They might have an interest in you going somewhere. So here, Constantine funded the bishops, put them up, entertained them. That's just the way these things worked at the time. In Eusebius' assessment, the major achievement of Constantine was that he brought together one God and one empire. Here's a quote from Eusebius. "Constantine brought under his control one Roman Empire, united as of old, the first to proclaim to all the monarchy of God, and by monarchy himself directing the whole of life under Roman rule." In other words, the monarchy of the empire mirrored God's own monarchy. Next slide. This is one of the central terms in the Nicene Creed. In Greek, it's homoousios. You have the Greek spelling here as well, which means of the same substance. So in the Creed, as you may recall, this is one of the battles against the Arians. So this comes from the original Creed in 325. Of course, it is still there in 381. This is the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed that we now recite as the Nicene Creed. So 325 is the roots of this. It gets reused again in 381, and this is still in the language of what we are now commonly reciting when we're reciting the Nicene Creed today in our churches. The main point here is that the Father and the Son, the first and the second person of the Trinity, are homoousios, which means they are of the same substance. Next slide. This is actually an aerial shot I didn't take, but this is what the church, the foundations of the church in Nicaea look like today. This was the old basilica where the council took place, or parts of the council most likely, and it is now submerged in the lake underwater. But you get a little bit of a picture of where these 300 plus bishops plus Constantine met. The basic point, just recalling some things that you may already know, but the basic point of this homoousios, so first and second person of the Trinity, was to contradict the Arian opposition party. The Arians claimed that there was indeed a qualitative distinction between Father and Son, with the Son taking a lower place than the Father. To protect the monotheistic faith and the absolute holiness of God, Arius and his followers claimed a hierarchy between God on top and Son at the bottom, where Nicaea actually claimed equality. That's quite interesting. We'll get back to that. The Arians, however, were adamant that hierarchy was needed, both for theological and political reasons. The Arian theologian Eunomius made it clear that he wanted to preserve both the superiority of God and the monarchy. So those things are always related. The Arians seem to be worried, and maybe rightly so, that putting the second person, the Son, at the same level of the first would introduce a significant disorder and messiness not only in the Godhead, but also into the monarchy. Remember, Constantine had just conquered his rival Licinius, so he wasn't that interested in having a co-emperor either, right? You had to have one at the top. That was the Arian idea. The Nicenes emphasized co-equality, the homoousia, and I think this is the interesting thing that we now have to talk about. Nevertheless, while they found equality within the Godhead, I mean, right now we're just talking about Father and Son. The Holy Spirit came later. That was another conversation. But in 325, he was the first two people. Nicaea still had a differentiation between God and creation. So there was God at the top. Wherever Jesus was, the creation was way below. This would have been customary in Roman religions of the time and in certain pre-Nicene Christologies. Let's take a quick look at the socio-political context of this distinction. Between the 2nd and the 5th centuries, at a time when social differentiations between the wealthy and the powerful, in contrast with all the rest, were becoming more aggravated. Social differentiations between the wealthy and the powerful and the rest sound familiar, right? This is something that we're seeing today. But back then, divine power was represented on earth by a small elite headed by the emperor at the very top. Church leaders and bishops played an important role in this regard. Along with the emperor at the top, they also mediated the supernatural. But while Nicaea was the product of a collaborative effort of people with different points of view, it soon sunk into oblivion. So this is one of the paradoxes. This important creed that maintained the empire very quickly was forgotten. And about 15 years later, it was Athanasius, the theologian, who developed his own interest in the Nicene Creed, and he brought back the basic theology. At a time when Arius had already passed away, so Arianism was not a problem anymore, but Athanasius apparently felt there was a use for this kind of theology. He was the one that constructed the ideas of Nicaea as ecumenical and as authoritative. He came up with the idea of identifying the Nicene Creed with the apostolic tradition, and he was the first one to call the bishops fathers. Next image, please. Here's another Christ coin, and this brings me to the theological problem. If you dig deeper, and I want to skip over a few things to give us more time for discussion, you'll see that Christ is shaped, Athanasius Christ via Nicaea, is shaped in the image of an abstract Godhead, which is defined as omnipotent, immutable, and impassible, all the attributes of classical theism. This is something that didn't come necessarily from the New Testament, but from Roman and Greek philosophies. Together with Nicaea, Athanasius asserts Christ's divinity, but is not really interested in Christ's life and ministry. And this, here's the problem of the Nicene Creed, leads to a Christological vacuum. Why is there a Christological vacuum? You can see it in the creeds itself. What is not mentioned in the Nicene Creed, by the way, it's the same for the Apostles' Creed, and it's also true in the Athanasian Creed. They say a few things about Christ, but they don't say one or a couple of things that are important in Christ's history. What's lacking in, maybe the Apostles' Creed you remember better, right? Believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered death. What's missing there between birth and death? Life and ministry. And it's the same in the Nicene Creed, right? You don't have the life and the ministry of Christ. As a result, and I think you can see this then in the theologies that spin off of Nicaea, is you have these abstract Christologies where the second and the first person are on the same level, they're equal, but what happens invariably is that the second person gets domesticated by the first. Talk about colonization, the second person gets colonized by the first person, which is envisioned in terms of the emperor, omnipotent, immutable, impassible, and so on. So in these theologies you have a problem because the Godhead in the end looks very much like the emperor, and so does Christ. Christ now gets moved into heaven, sits on a throne, looks down a lot, but is not engaged, is not in the struggle anymore. So this is, it seems to me, the fundamental problem of the Nicene Creed. While you're creating equality in the Godhead, which is a crucial thing I'll come back to in a minute, you're also creating a Christological vacuum. So let me now shift gears and come to the fun part of the lecture. That's part of the history we have to deal with. Now the question is, what do we do? What do we do with it? Next slide. If you can see this, this is actually a little pebble. This is my hand holding up a little brick pebble to the ancient walls. And the little brick pebble was pulled out of the lake of Isnik, as it is called now, right next to the cathedral. So it's possible that this little pebble was part of one of the foundations of the ancient cathedral, which is interesting because the ancient way of making bricks like that goes back to Emperor Augustine. So you actually have an imperial tradition of brickmaking, which were the foundations of the Roman Empire, that are now crumbling in a way, but they're still there. This is the theological surplus, as it were. Maybe a little image here to envision what we're talking about. How these ancient empires made these bricks that lasted even in the lake for 1700 years. And perhaps they're still the witness as to what matters. So let's go on to the constructive implications here. While the Roman Empire had a significant impact on the formation of the Nicene Creed, the crucial question is in what sense creeds might exceed the perspective of empire. That's what I'm interested in. Might there be some theological surplus that refuses to be homogenized by empires and pushes in a different direction? For all the influence of empires throughout history, there is something about Christianity that keeps challenging the status quo of empires. After all, already the 2nd century Roman philosopher Celsus perceived Christianity as a threat to the Roman Empire and a voice of rebellion. Christian monotheism, Celsus claimed, would lead to the rejection of the values and gods of the wider community. And maybe he was right. Celsus was the one that accused Christianity of being atheistic. And he was right about that because Christians were indeed atheists when it came to the traditional gods of the empire. Christians rejected the dominant gods. The Romans were not stupid. I mean, they were even religiously inclusive. So you could have all kinds of gods in the Roman pantheon, except Jesus Christ, right? Why? Not because he was human. The Romans could add humans to their pantheon too. But because he did not match theistic images of a God who was omnipotent, top-down power above the world, and all of that. So there's a challenge here built into the heart of Christianity. In fact, the book, the Jesus versus Caesar book that's going around, is talking more about this atheism question, which is not the rejection of all gods, but it is the rejection of the dominant gods of the time. And that may well be the theological challenge to us today as well. And I think this is now where the Nicene Creed can be looked at with new eyes. There's a theological surplus, I'm arguing, that came through this creed, perhaps without anybody knowing it for the longest time. Next slide. In this picture, also in Nicaea, this was our working group, you see a very diverse group of people picking up the Nicene Creed again 1700 years later. Young woman from Africa, from South Africa, a young Maori woman theologian from New Zealand, an Indian Mar Thoma bishop, a Greek Orthodox woman theologian, a Serbian Orthodox theologian, two Indian Anglicans, one living in London, one living in Germany. You can see the diversity of this group. And you can imagine that this group might not go along as easily with the old imperial theology. So just to put a few faces to people who are now rethinking the Nicene Creed, together with all of us here in the room. So let me look at this surplus and how it emerges. Keep in mind, Christianity early on was actually quite diverse, and there were upper and lower class Christians. They were intertwined in a special way because in early Christianity the classes were not as strictly separated as they were elsewhere in the Roman Empire. Now for the rich this had particular benefits because it supported their claim to power and justified their wealth. Remember, the churches themselves increasingly became major landowners and employers. So this combination of the rich and the poor here was oftentimes used in favor of the rich. But on the other hand, the links of the rich and the poor might have also had unexpected impacts on the formation of doctrine in the councils. And here let me quote historian Peter Brown, who's certainly no radical, but he argued that this solidarity with the poor that emerged in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, quoting him here, challenged the rich and the powerful to become aware of the sufferings of their fellow humans, as God himself had shared in human suffering. At the core, according to Brown, is the early Christian sense of the joining of God and humanity in the person of Christ, and by mysterious extension, in the persons of the poor. So the second person here, where Christ now joins divinity, humanity, not in terms of universal humanity, but in the light of the poor, might shake up the whole imperial idea of the divine, of the Nicene Creed. Note that in this joining of God and humanity, practical consequences came about that seem radical even today. In the Theodosian code, the Emperor Theodosius, his code from the 4th and 5th centuries, there were 5 laws that supported church asylum as an existing ecclesial practice. Church asylum, this is so interesting, was granted not only to people unable to pay their debts, it was also granted to people who were accused of criminal charges. So the churches were real places of resistance and refuge for people who experienced the pressures of the empire. So you could see that as part of the Nicene traditions too. One of the problematic legacies of the Nicene Creed is that the unity that Athanasius constructed after the fact produced a kind of theological homogeneity that was not realized even at the council itself. The theological concept of homoousios, for instance, is not homogeneous, and it is often noted that this term, which was introduced by the emperor at the council, is actually imprecise and therefore has some weaknesses. But I might argue that this imprecision and these weaknesses are actually good things. To have a theological term here that's open-ended might be better than to have a theological term that's too narrow. And even traditional historical theologians who do not otherwise problematize Nicaea praise this open-endedness in the creed. Perhaps we can find in this indeterminacy an example of the theological surplus. Because it's produced by the multitude of the people who cannot easily be pressed into one form. This might be further theorized. Maybe we can talk about this afterwards. In the post-colonial traditions, where you have notions of ambivalence, mimicry, hybridity, we can't go into the details here, but there's some real powerful dynamics in the heart of the creed that are oftentimes missed. Next slide. On this slide, you see a church from the 8th century. This is where most likely the Second Council of Nicaea was held in 787. And what is so interesting, of course, this is Turkey now, which is a majority Islamic country. This is now a mosque. You go into it, you visit the mosque. When we went in, there were people having their prayers. They were fine with us walking into it. You walk into the back of the church, and you still see some of the ancient Christian frescoes. In the mosque, they didn't erase them, they didn't paint over them. And so this is an interesting example of how the various faiths, in a way, keep respecting each other. There was an ancient principle that they might teach you in church history, that the lex credendi is the lex orandi. So the lex, the law of prayer, the rule of prayer, is the rule of faith. In other words, the common worship is the foundation for the faith, for what is actually believed. And so what I want to argue here, and this is where I think the connection to Fiji becomes really clear, is that if you look at the faith of the common people, don't just look at the official documents. I mean, as you draw up your own document, ask the question, how is the faith of the common people entering into this? As you look at the faith of the common people, something changes in these dominant statements, and we have to read for that. We have to look out what that is. And so with the homoousios here, the same substance of Father and Son, we can now push not only beyond Athanasius, but we can now do some exciting theological work. First of all, it's clear that the empire can no longer completely control the faith and the lives of everyone. There's an ambivalence built into these ancient traditions that reminds us not only of the diversity of the bishops themselves. Most of the time these bishops were not in agreement either. But it reminds us that orthodoxy itself is not as unilateral as it oftentimes seems. In fact, this homogeneity of orthodoxy has to be challenged so that orthodoxy, the right faith, can find its real place in the lives of the church. You could make the same argument for other Orthodox traditions, including European and Western traditions, which are not as homogeneous as is oftentimes claimed either. And what we have to do now is we have to look for the cracks, the gaps, the fissures, and to read for them in order to apply this back to our own lives. Next slide. Give me a couple of more minutes and we'll conclude this. This is again the group that met there in Turkey. Now you see the fence. Behind that fence in the lake is the old foundations of the church. And I chose that picture, the group actually reciting the Nicene Creed right there, because it shows you some of this ambivalence. It shows you some of this dynamic that we're talking about. So, what happens if we rethink the homoousios in this slide? Diversity is definitely one part of it, and nobody was exactly able to conclude what the homoousios meant, but there's some limits. It's like this fence, not anything goes, not everything goes, and now the question is what happens? This homoousios, in a way, bringing the church together, has to be read in a different direction. So first, early on in the empire part, I said Constantine's idea was that we can domesticate the second person in light of the first. My suggestion is, what if we turn this around? What if we read the first person in light of the second? What if we understand God, the Father, the first person, the divinity, the Creator, in light of the Redeemer, right? What if we look at the life and the ministry of Christ and read this back into the Nicene Creed, thereby deconstructing imperial images of God, questioning, overcome theistic notions like omnipotence, impassibility, immutability that don't quite match with Jesus, and to ask again what this means for our understandings, not only of the first person of the Trinity, but of the Trinity as a whole. This to me seems one of the big possibilities of the Nicene Creed that the Arians thought they had foreclosed, they could foreclose. In fact, sometimes people think Arians are liberals because they have a low Christology. It seems to me Arians are really interested in preserving the monarchy of God so that God cannot be rethought. But the liberals that oftentimes want to play down Christ and they think of Christ as, maybe a good human person, as someone who is maybe a prophet, a wisdom preacher, you name it, miss the opportunity to read the second and the first person together. That to me is the ultimate challenge of the Nicene Creed. How do we read the second and the first person together in a way that changes our view of God? Let me give you a quote of the U.S. Latino church historian Justo Gonzalez. He once wrote this: "If a carpenter condemned to death as an outlaw, someone who had nowhere to lay his head, was declared to be God of very God, such a declaration would put into doubt the very view of God and of hierarchy on which imperial power rested." Now, one thing we know about Constantine is that at the end of his life, he actually abandoned the Nicene tradition and went back to Arianism. On his deathbed, he was baptized by an Arian priest. And perhaps Constantine realized the dangers of the Nicene tradition to the empire. But this is the challenge, and I think this is the beauty. Final slide. One more. This is the question of Jesus versus Caesar. Is Caesar ultimately shaping our images of God, or is Jesus shaping our images of God? By introducing Jesus into the Godhead, I think this is the question that Nicaea raises up for us. How do we rethink God? How do we rethink questions of big metaphysical questions on the one hand? How do we rethink questions of ousia and being, which are now no longer static, but developing in a history, developing in a struggle, developing in our incarnate fashion where God and humanity are always working together. It seems to me it's not an accident that the life and ministry of Christ are not mentioned in the creeds, and certainly not in the Nicene Creed. Like Freudian slips of the tongue, these things don't happen just by chance. But this is, of course, the chance that we now have in our religious traditions, where we can read the life and the ministry of Christ together with the ancient creeds. So it really depends on what you're making with this theologically. It really depends on how we read our own traditions, our own lives, our own contexts back into these old creeds. So I see a real subversive potential here of the Nicene Creed, not just rescuing an old statement, but saying this is something that could essentially help us reclaim and rethink who we are as people of faith in our own time. Let me add a very final note here to this bigger discussion of how we read the persons of the Trinity and the ministry of Christ. There's one thing that is also missing in the Nicene Creed that's sometimes not noticed. What is missing here are sacrificial penal substitution theories, where we think about Christ mainly in terms of dying on the cross so that we can go to heaven. This has never been codified in any of the ancient ecumenical councils, And so it seems to me that this is yet another Christological question that we can say for another day. But what the Nicene Creed does for us in this world, where Christology is so oftentimes just a transaction between God and humanity, is that it reminds us again of the bigger picture of who God is, of the incarnation at the heart of everything, at the heart of redemption, at the heart of salvation. And I would argue, at the very end of this lecture here, at the heart of your motto of your university, which is the whole of life. This is what the Nicene Creed brings back to us in a way that comes as a surprise perhaps for those of us who always saw it as an imperial tradition. But there's some work that has to be done, and this is why I'm still excited to do my work after all these years. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. So I'll close here. I'll open it up for discussion. Thank you. So please, if you want to prevent me from lecturing for another hour, you have to ask some questions. And to make this fun, feel free to push back a little bit. This is when we learn together. I know that you're in the process of writing your own creed, so one of the questions here would be, what is the use of creedal traditions? Why should we even go through this work? And of course, what are the dangers and what are the promises? So how do you feel about creeds? Maybe that's a place to begin. I see Professor Fafetai.
Thank you, Professor, for the interesting presentation. I think in terms of creeds or just policy making in general, just when you create policies, we have this dilemma between leaving things open and limited and over-defining things. And we see that in Nicaea from Odysseus, and I see where you're going with, when it remains ambivalent, it needs to be engaged. And, you be open to interpretation, and that's great. When you over-define it, it also becomes a sort of divisive thing. How would you see, what way do you think would help us overcome that tension?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So at one level, keeping the notion open-ended has benefits, as I was trying to say. The fact that it's not a precise philosophical notion, the fact that different people can read it differently, leaves some work to be done. But the problem is, as you know from physics, nature abhors a vacuum. There's never a vacuum in nature, so whenever you leave something open, something else comes in, it fills in. And what I see in my analysis is that what usually comes in is dominant positions. So if you leave open the life and the ministry of Christ, very quickly then Christ looks like Caesar. Christ looks like the dominant idea. By the way, in the Confession of Chalcedon in 451, you have the homoousios again, where Chalcedon reaffirms Christ is of the same substance as the Father, homoousios to patri. And then it says, Christ is of the same substance as us, homoousios henin in the Greek. And so again, now you have humanity defined in your Christology. But when it is left open, and this was my critique earlier of the Chalcedonian Confession, when it is left open, it usually gets filled in by dominant images of divinity and dominant images of humanity. That's the same problem, if you simply fill in the dominant idea of who is the human being, right? I know we've already talked about the whole idea of the Western dominance. Then you have this idea of a Western white male as sort of the image of humanity. That's a problem. So that is to say, ultimately you have no choice. You have to bring in some of these debates if you want to avoid the dominant powers giving the answers for you. So today I think this is the big problem in the United States, where the dominant position is very quickly talking about God and even Jesus Christ. There are images of Donald Trump not only as the Pope but as the Messiah and Jesus Christ and so on, without asking any questions of what does Christ actually look like. And that then, the problem is not just that we have diversity of opinions, but the problem, I would say, is heresy. That it gets you into some very unchristian, some very dangerous heretical images of divinity and perhaps also of humanity. So the next question then is, how do we do this, right? How do we actually provide some of this specificity without running into the other problems that you're describing? But it seems to me, and maybe this is a question to the group, that you have found some ways to negotiate this. I was at worship service this morning, right? We were not talking about the independence of Fiji, but we were all together celebrating the independence of Papua New Guinea, right? And the Fijians weren't saying, well, we don't care. There was sort of a common resonance here. Where I'm wondering, in other words, to be specific here might need that diversity in order to really get to the core of it.
Thank you, Professor. I just wanted to get you started. I'm presenting on a similar topic tomorrow, so I think I'm on the right track.
All right. Thank you, Fafatai.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I appreciate hearing that history presentation. When you said, what would it look like if the second person of the Trinity defined the first one rather than the other way around? It struck me that that's exactly what Philippians 2 is, the kenosis passage. It actually tells the story of Jesus from God to doulos to the total kenosis, self-emptying, becoming nothing, and then only then kurios. So it's a Christ-shaped narrative. The creed. I have often entertained the idea, what if the creedal statements are actually just more scriptural? Like if we had, 1 Timothy 3:16, we had, 1 Corinthians 15, we provide the raw material for the history part, but then the shape, the whole narrative shape being Philippians 2. And maybe that's what, if I understand you correctly, you'd be describing as Christological surplus.
That's right.
It's something so absolutely different than Empire. It's a Lord who no one's ever imagined before. So if I do. Maybe it's kind of a counterfactual approach to history. What if the creeds had instead gone back to the scriptures rather than looking for Greek terminology? How might that have ended up very different? And we do have the raw material for creedal statements all through the New Testament. And then Philippians 2 being probably the church's first worship song. So that idea I wanted to throw. Has anyone written on that, or has there been any creed of the sorts to wanting to gather all of the New Testament material.
That may be something for you to write, actually, Brian, because what I find in the world that I know is there's usually this juxtaposition. On the one hand, there's the creedal theologians, and then there are the others who say we don't like the creeds. So nobody really is looking at this much more interesting and complex way of putting it together. So there's a lot of rejection of the creeds. The Historical Jesus Seminar, that's a US phenomenon. There's so much emphasis on the historical Jesus, and I know a lot of these folks. For them, there's really no interest at all in thinking about Jesus as divine. So, John Dominic Crossan and I, we've lectured together in all kinds of places. And Dom is not interested in thinking about Jesus as divine. I am very much interested in that because I think that's what we need. Without that, we're losing our debate. I mean, the liberal idea of divine as a higher power or something, is just toothless in terms of a conservative idea, excuse me, of an imperial God who works from the top down. So that's the kind of work that we need. Now, keep in mind, this is the theological principle here. Of course, this is where maybe Protestants should talk to each other more. Not to disparage anybody who's not a Protestant, but to say the primacy of Scripture. In my Methodist tradition, this is something that we emphasize a lot, is absolutely necessary in order to make sense of the creeds. I had a colleague, a conservative Methodist I never understood, who argued that you have to read the Bible through the lens of the creed. And I said, that's not our Methodist way of doing things. We read the creeds through the lens of the Bible. That's different. But once you do that, now you have a lot of work to do. That's good work. And keep in mind, I'm glad you're quoting Paul here, because Paul is actually our friend. See, people think Jesus was the radical, and then Paul was sort of the conservative who all did this metaphysical mumbo-jumbo about going to heaven. But Paul has a very clear imperial resistance theory. By the way, this is the first chapter in the Christ and Empire book. Starts not with the historical Jesus, but with Paul, where some of the scholars are now saying Paul is actually one of the early anti-imperial theologians. And you know this, right? When Paul talks about the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12, how does he end it? If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. The body of Christ image in the Roman Empire was an imperial image. It meant we're all organically related, and that's wonderful. But if you're at the top, you're at the top, and if you're at the bottom, that's where you are. Paul shuffles that around and reads the body of Christ from the bottom up. The weaker members, are the ones that actually challenge the body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. All that stuff. So you get this kind of resistance theology in the Bible, which is why I think this work with our biblical traditions, which we have to understand as contextual traditions, is so important. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Joerg, for the very constructive and thoughtful presentation, as always. It's always to listen to you and the challenges that you give. I like the balance of what you give in many of your lectures and also in your writings as well. I want to just reflect on a few points on this. Perhaps what Brian was saying, the Cappadocians brought that later, and the fluidity of the Trinity. That wherever you start in the Trinity, whether you start with the Father, the Son, the Spirit, you'll always end up with a hope. The tensions between Western societies and indigenous societies, that Western Christianity tends to push more into the Christological aspect of Christianity. The indigenous communities tend to emphasize more the spirit sacredness of creation. So the Spirit emphasis is on there. And the tension has always been there. When you go into Christianity, you always want to have an entry point where Christ is the first, but then you have this linear kind of progression within the Trinity, that you must always start with the Father, this hierarchy, Father, Son, and Spirit. But the Cappadocians solve that. The Cappadocians say, whether you start with the Father, we start with Christ, we start with the Spirit, you'll end up with the whole. You'll end up with the Father and the Spirit. So whenever it's a starting point, we don't have to be hierarchical and linear in interpreting the Trinity because of the fluidity within the Trinity. And I find that because the tensions that we, indigenous people, are more into the spirituality aspect of creation, more into the sacredness of creation. They see the animation of the Spirit in creation. Even the Pentecostals, they start with, they're more into the Spirit, and then later into the Christology, Father aspect. So, that dynamics needs to be maintained So that's my first point. The second point is in relation to the language. The coming on board in the 4th century and the production of the Trinity really created a lot of binaries, as we see today. So right and the left and all of that. And there's a Christian and there's a heretic, that was introduced at that time, especially the 3rd and the 4th century. There's a lot. Areas, of course, included as one of the really top heretic that was sort of like framed as against the doctrine of the empire at the time. And the term homoousios came on board. Thank you for clarifying that. What I would perhaps want to dig more into is the philosophy, the Aristotelianism, philosophical standpoint that was behind the thoughts of not only Athanasius, but also the Cappadocians, but also the Arians as well. And particularly the idea of substance, which later on the Cappadocians bring in the notion of relations in the Trinity. I wonder what you think about it, because it's always difficult to talk first about one substance. In many countries in the world, outside of Christianity, they don't talk about substance first, or one being. They always talk about relations first. And within those relations, you identify and determine the idea of being and substance. So being in relation, as other theologians has put later on in the conversation. But that was grounded on a philosophical basis that was at that time. That's either substance or relation. It cannot be both. So it's an either way of thinking that Aristotelianism brought into the picture. I wonder what would you think of that, because it was also the first time ever that the notion of substance was really put into the highlight, into the limelight, which of course carried a lot of its impact into the Reformation later on. And I want to ask you about that. The third one is in relation to the abstract Christologies that you have. From those abstract Christologies, we have a lot of what the theories of atonement. In the Pacific, we are really oppressed by those theories of atonement. The panel, theory and other theories as well. What we see now in the Christianity world, and particularly the Pacific, is that the church stands in the position of the Father, while others stands in the position of Christ, to sacrifice and empty oneself to serve the Father. Talatala those in power, stands in the position of the Father, while the congregation stands in the position of Christ, who serves and gives to the church at the expense. So the hierarchy of the Trinitarian thinking is still there, very much strong in the Pacific. And we see also that around the world today, collapse of the systems and structures that were since the 1960s, and we see today the reaffirmation of that hierarchy, where there is a powerful and there is a servant, the class classification that you always talk about. But it's an impact it's a theological impact that really has influence in many of our systems, in particular Christianity. At the moment, that's my third point. And perhaps my last one, and this is for me, it's very critical. It's part of my life. When I did my PhD on the Trinity, I had to study all of this. The idea that the West and theologians couldn't even hold both what we call in the theological language paradox. The issue with the 4th century is that it leaned towards more the affirmation of faith. And perhaps what Arius was trying to do, and Arianism afterward, is the sense of denial of faith. So holding both together, the affirmation and denial, faith is not about whether we affirm or deny. It's a tug of war. It's a weaving of both the affirmation and the denial that is the completion of faith, which we call paradox in a theological language. And today we are so much into the affirming side that we don't know the negation side, and holding both tensions together in our faith. We are so into the notion of assurance, perfection, purity. We are no longer talking about dirt. We don't talk about struggles in the community because we're into a kind of faith that is about perfection. So we cannot hold both, and that is where we're trying to bring in the idea of the whole of life, is holding both tensions together, which is a more healthy way of looking at the Trinity, rather than what was introduced in the 4th century, which is more about affirmation and then exclude all others and label them heretics, because they bring in, like Arius, Arius brought in the idea of non-identical to God. Christ is non-identical to God, which is also correct in some way, because the Son is the same as the Father, but it's not the same as the Father. So that paradox needs to be maintained in a way, and we see that today in our communities in the Pacific. When you go to the Pacific, we carry ourselves as communal persons. We carry our village, our cultures, our traditions with us. We can say that we are homoousios, same substance with our ancestors in the past, but we are not our ancestors. So we have to hold both together, both individuality and communality, both assurance and also the potential risks that comes with that, because that is, I think, the whole of faith that we need to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. You can see why I took some notes, because I wanted to make sure I get to all of your points. This this is why we keep working together, because we have these questions of each other. And I want to take a couple of minutes to respond to this, because this is so important. I mean, so many things that you've raised here are really putting us on a different track. So this is not just a debate between two individuals. This is really a bigger theological debate, which, you know, we might think about writing up. I mean, there's something here. So let me just give you and everybody a couple of responses here. I mean, in so many ways, I'm very much in agreement. In that, yes, and I would add a few things. So the 4 points, as I've noted them, the first one, the question of indigenous fluidity, spirituality, and so on. You brought that together with the Cappadocian Fathers. There was a development, these three Greek theologians, the two Gregories and Basil Basil the Great, they came up with this notion of the homoousios. So homoousios means of the same substance. Homoousios means of like substance. So there's a little bit of give and take there. And some people have argued that even Athanasius could go that way. So in other words, there's some openings in the ancient theologians. But the more important question, I think, is the indigenous one about starting with the Spirit, starting with spirituality. And of course, we see Pentecostal movements, we see spiritual movements around the world that are very powerful, but in different ways. So there's spiritual movements that very much proclaim the gospel of prosperity, you know those. And then there are spiritual movements that stick much more to the legacy of Jesus. A rule of thumb question I would suggest to anybody, which I learned from one of my professors many years ago. Actually, on October 6th is 30 years since he died, Frederick Herzog. He asked this question, what is Jesus doing now? Very simple Sunday school-like question, what is Jesus doing now? And in order to ask that question, you need to have a strong spirituality. You need to have a strong doctrine of the Spirit, because you really think about Jesus then in terms of what the Spirit is doing in the world. You can also think about spirituality. This was José Comblanc, a Belgian priest who spent most of his life in Brazil. He said, when we think about the incarnation of Christ, we think about an individual. When we think about the Spirit, we think about many incarnations in humanity. So there's an embodiedness of the Spirit here. Once you plug that back into the Trinitarian understanding, I think it gets very productive, very constructive. And it brings back the value of indigenous spirituality, then not simply as, oh, there's something in addition to everything else, but as something that could actually recenter and refocus us as a whole. So that's important too, not just pluralism, have more and more stuff, but have something that can help us recenter and reclaim. So that was maybe a quick response to this fluidity and spirituality point. Your second point was about the binaries. And especially when it comes to substance, I think that is a problem. So we have these binaries of heaven and earth and material and spiritual and man and woman, and all of these things get declared natural. Might not be so natural. You know, a lot of this is actually produced and it's always connected. So starting with the substance, I think, and the binaries is indeed a problem. Your suggestion to start with relationships actually matches with what I was trying to do. So rather than start with the substance, you start with, well, in the beginning was the relation, as it were. What is the beginning of the relation? The Trinity relating to itself, God relating to creation, the Trinity relating to creation. You know, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and so on. And then, of course, in the Gospel of John, you have the Word was made flesh. So there's the end of your binary, right? It's not some spiritual thing up there, but it pulls everything together. Where I would push it a bit, though, is to say what are some of the most fundamental relationships. And when I talk to my folks, in Europe or the United States about relationships, they get all excited. There's one relationship they do not want to talk about. That is the relationship of labor. The labor relationship as, employer, employee, or worker and boss, which is really strange because I submit to you, this is one of the most fundamental relationships there is. Because you spend your bulk of your waking hours at work. So once we talk about relationships, I'd say let's include some of the relationships that we're often ignoring. The labor relationship to me seems one of the crucial ones. I've actually argued that this may be one of the most genuine theological concerns. Also because, as Jesus says again, Gospel of John, my Father is working, I'm working also. So you have this agency question here that has to be addressed in terms of relationships. Now, here's the paradox. Now you talk about relationships, and for some odd reason, you bring back the binary. Because now it's not a natural binary, but it is an accepted binary where the boss is the boss and you're not. In other words, when it comes to labor, everywhere else, we want to be democratic. Everywhere else, we want to be relational. When we go to work, all of a sudden, there is no relationship anymore. The boss is the boss, you shut up. There is no democracy. Once you close the door behind you at work, now you're in a dictatorship. A very strange thing. And I submit to you that the lack of this relationship creates a lot of trouble. In the church, in our personal relationships, in our families, maybe even our sexual relationships, we have this domination scheme that we learn somewhere. And so, staying with your theme of critiquing the binary, Polo, there's a binary we still have to work on, it seems to me, even though we're more enlightened when it comes to the other binaries. So, back to the relationship, you can see how Trinity all of a sudden relates to labor relationships. And I submit to you, that's what your bosses don't want to hear. And that's what they don't want to talk about at the UN either, and at the embassy, and in the church leadership. This is your next point about these sacrificial theologies where the church is the father, and it demands sacrifices of everybody else. I think that's the problem of relationships these days, that we have this top-down vision where, it depends on what your church is. If you're a bishop, you can determine if you're, somebody who sits on the throne, you can determine, and everybody else gets sacrificed. If we had a lot more time, I would take this back through some of the ancient atonement theories, which can be deconstructed actually. Anselm of Canterbury, that's chapter 4 in the Christ and Empire book, but I see Nico actually raising his hand. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, because I just want to ask from the non-Trinitarian perspective. Here, there were Christians who were not Trinitarian pre-Nicene. And today we still have Christians who are not Trinitarian.
Sorry, say again, who are not?
Who are non-Trinitarian.
Oh, non-Trinitarian, yes, okay, yeah.
So, the question I want to ask is, one, because we are very quick Trinitarian Christians to judge and exclude non-Trinitarian Christians. The second question is, who gets to draw the rules of how we define God, how to see God?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Now, that adds a whole other perspective. I mean, if you're coming from a Unitarian perspective, if you're coming from a different perspective, the conversation about the Trinity, in my view, does not have to mean to exclude non-Trinitarian perspectives. What we're doing here is making sense of what the Trinitarian perspectives might imply. So if you're coming from somewhere else, I think that's okay. It's not to say you have to embrace this. But it is to say that there is something in the Trinitarian perspectives that has to be worked out in this historical self-critical fashion that I was suggesting, namely to ask, what is the history here? What is the history of power? And as we just heard, there's a whole complexity. I mean, you have Athanasius, you have the Cappadocian Fathers, you have Augustine coming in. These are all Trinitarian perspectives that don't always quite gel with each other either. So at that point, who calls the shots, I guess, is your question. Like, who makes the decision as to what is what? My suggestion would be work with the tradition in which you're working. In other words, if you're working within a Trinitarian perspective, it's perfectly fine and fair to have questions about Trinitarianism. That has to be worked out. But it doesn't necessarily mean that anything goes. So in other words, if you work within a Trinitarian perspective and that doesn't make sense to you, well, you have other options. You work with somebody else, right? On the other hand, if you're working from a non-Trinitarian perspective and there's something in the doctrine of the Trinity that resonates, you might figure out why it is that your tradition actually rejects the doctrine of the Trinity. And there are good reasons for that too, right? The reason why we have Unitarian perspectives is because of some of the problems that Trinitarianism has created. So in this way, it's not mutually exclusive. You could even say there are some interreligious components here as well. How do you work as a Trinitarian with somebody from, say, a Muslim or a Jewish tradition, which very strictly emphasizes monotheism, which cannot deal with another person next to God. The way I do it, to give you one example, the way I do it with my Muslim friends is to say, I totally respect the position that looks at God at a very high transcendental level, as Muslim theology oftentimes does. But in my Christian tradition, we have the incarnation, and I cannot give that up. That doesn't mean I don't respect you, but I can explain to you why the incarnation is so important in my faith. That doesn't mean I need to convert you to my position, but I'm passionate about this, not just because I think it's a good theological idea, but also because I would argue that this is something that the Christian faith in some ways has to deal with it one way or another.
Just one point. Just want to share a secret with you. It's a secret on developing the vision of this university. In the past 5 years, 5 to 6 years, we've struggled. We've had multiple consultations, conversations with faculty, staff, and students on how we frame this whole Trinitarian faith of the church in a wording and in a phrase that is both theological but also cultural, political, and economic as well. Hence is the whole of life. The whole of life is at its core Trinitarianism. You can find there the coherence of the Father, Son, and Spirit, which is one of the key principles of the whole of life. You find in there the integrated relationships between the Father, Son, and Spirit in the world. Goes back to the 4th century. You can find in there the paradox, or mutual contradictions, that the Father is the Son, but the Father is not the Son. So both the affirmation and the denial is there as well. You can also find what Brian is talking about in Philippians 2 as well, the kenosis, which in the words that principles that we use is the principle of restraint, of force, of waiting, a kind of reflection, time to pause and reflect and restrain, which is the kenotic theology. everything about the Trinity is in the whole of life. But we word it in a way that when people talk about it, they talk about it as if a cultural thing, but it's a woolly Trinitarian theological concept. So hence is the secret of creating the whole of life. It's Trinitarian, it's focused, the principle of Trinitarian, it's relational, it keeps both tensions, but it's also about restraint, it's about leaving room for the other person, it's about sharing of love and communion. I just want to share this because in the past 5 to 6 years, we try to develop a vision that is both theological rooted and also philosophically rooted in this.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end, but I think this is a great way of wrapping a few things up. If the focus is life and the whole of life, I think this is a way of talking about what is life-giving. The goal is the flourishing of life. And it seems to me that's the measuring stick, right? That's where you ultimately ask questions about how life-giving is your theology. So a Trinitarian theology like the one you're suggesting has to prove itself, not just how logical it is, but is it life-giving? And once you can show this, I think you really have made a case. In response to Nico's question, if you have a Unitarian theology that might come from a different principle that also shows how it is life-giving, it seems to me then you've made your case and you can be in collaboration. You don't have to claim identity. You don't have to claim we're all doing the same thing, but you can say we're working on the same issue. The reason why I emphasize that is we have to be very clear about what is not life-giving either. And so here comes the trick. There's a place where you have to draw a line. So we want to be inclusive, we want to be open, but we have to draw the line with the kind of things that are not life-giving. So if there's a Trinitarian theology that's death-dealing, for me as a German originally, the Holocaust is always the easy one, right? I can say there is a German Holocaust theology that is death-dealing. And the Reichsbishop Ludwig Müller, when he was elected, that was Hitler's chosen bishop to bring the church in sync with the government, said, hey, I believe in all the doctrines. So he was a full-fledged Trinitarian, but also a Nazi supporting Hitler's project. That's where we have to draw the line. That happens with every other religion as well. So no religion is off the hook. Every religion has to answer the question, where do you draw the line? Is there a line? And once you've answered it, now we can have a conversation. Now we can, those of us, myself included, who are Trinitarians, can say, look, this is what our perspective brings. You prove it. This is how you find respect. This is how you find conversation. And then the other perspective sort of makes its own case. But this is the paradox. We'll talk more about this on Friday night. How we actually build solidarity without being, just all-inclusive, wishy-washy, still able to draw lines, still able to say, this is from God, this is not from God, but at the same time really to work together broadly. And the good news, finally, with this relationship thing is there is always more of us than there is of them. I mean, sometimes we talk about marginalized and minorities, and we think this is small groups of people somewhere. In the United States, we talk about minority groups. We think there are small groups of people here and there. We talk about the poor, that's a small group. Well, let me remind you, when you talk about labor relationships, there's always more working people than bosses. Once you've said that, you realize that your solidarity of those who do the work is actually a solidarity in diversity. So there's not a matter of distinctions along race, gender, and other lines, but there is some built-in solidarity. We'll talk a lot more about that on Friday. But in the end, I mean, this is affirming the theme here, the whole of life education that you have picked, which I think is a fascinating theme. And of course, it's the reason why I'm here, because I not only agree with it, I want to learn more about it. And thanks for all the work that you have done on it already.
Yeah, Professor Rieger, thank you so much for giving us so many inputs for us to keep churning over and thinking about. So stimulating to hear how we can pull those different threads together and make sense in your mind, and how they might kind of transfer to the things that we're thinking about in our own contexts. And also to be aware of the context of others and the context of how this thing came to be, and the context of it changing through time. And you can't speak without talking about Bob, his context and how he approached the kenosis of Christ either. But thank you so much for really investing so much time and energy into us this afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here to receive this blessing. And if you thought this was good, which it was, there's more tomorrow and the next day for the next 2 days of the Royal Council of Churches conference on this very topic. So please make sure you subscribe and jump on Zoom tomorrow. I know some classes were actually cancelled today, so that you could do that, and not all the students did that, so I'll be after you. But let us just thank Professor Rieger in the usual way.